So in your opinion, we have discussed from the previous panel, but also the panelists in this session, they have also said there's a clear disconnect between food and nutrition. We have all these strategies. Do you think that we go back to the drawing board and start re-strategizing agriculture and nutrition in order for these small grains to find their place? Where should we start from? Should we just patch where we are, or we start re-strategizing and borrow some of the good examples you have highlighted? Over to you, Michael.
Well, thanks for the question, which is too big to answer comprehensively, I believe, because it's the answers are context specific. But what I can say is that many good policies are in place already. I mentioned aflatoxin, and in Kenya, I would cite that as a good example. But what Kenya shows very well is that consumer awareness and the ability of citizens to express their demands with regard to food and nutrition in terms of quantity and quality are critical. So I believe it's both a governance issue that we have at hand, as well as a bottom-up consumer-driven process. So strengthening policies to strengthen consumer protection groups will be critical, especially during that nutrition transition that we currently observe as countries move from low to middle income countries. Back to you.
There's a question for you in the chat box. Can you expand on the alternative narrative? What narrative should be not continue with, and what should be part of the new narrative?
Well, we're already progressing that narrative collectively, the new narrative, by expanding food security into the nutrition space. So it's not just carbohydrates, but it's also macro and micronutrients and vitamins, which are essential for nutrition. Our research shows very well how closely linked food narratives and consumption habits are. People eat the way they speak about food, and vice versa. And that is not only a local issue. That goes up to politics at the end. The way we speak about maize and food security vis-a-vis small grains for nutrition is something we have to get right. In our interviews with low-income populations, we constantly hear that well, millet, if we eat millet, we belong to the poorer segment of society, because it's a poor woman's or poor man's crop. And that's a kind of narrative that kind of is linked to the behavioral intention and the actual behavior at the end. And that has to be changed. And that's not something we can do just locally. That's something that requires campaigns, that requires awareness, that requires people and examples, as we've heard in this panel, people who in high positions who speak up and say, well, we want to diversify our food plate, because the diversity we consume is also the diversity we need on farms in order to transition well. Mrs. Chair?
Very much. Our audience, we have now opened for comments, questions to all the panelists. Tobias, I hope you're still there. There is a question directed to you. In your wide policy experience, have you seen good, effective examples of policies that supported value chains for more nutritious food? Tobias?
Thank you very much, Rebbie. I can reiterate that question and say, in Kenya, I saw the effective use of the e-voucher system for input distribution, where the government has capacity to partially fund the cost of seed and fertilizer and direct inputs to the correct areas. For example, where they are able to make sure that the sorghum and millet seed is placed in the agro dealers who are in the correct areas where the producers can actually be able to go there and procure the inputs using their voucher system and buy the correct inputs, as opposed to a system where blanket subsidies are just given to farmers. They may end up not using those inputs, or they may not use the correct inputs in the correct areas. Then I have cited an example of liberalization of the domestic market for small grains, with a recent example in Zimbabwe, where it has been possible for traders and millers to procure millets and sorghums directly from farmers, process them, and they market them through supermarkets without government-controlled prices. So I can say those two examples of utilization of e-voucher system to channel and the direct provision of inputs to the correct agroecological areas, and also the example of liberalization of the single channel marketing system to allow many players to process and determine the prices of sorghum and millets. I was walking yesterday in supermarkets in Harare, and I was delighted to see a shelf, full of different types of sorghum and millets. I should have taken a picture to share with you, but it's quite exciting to see that market liberalization is a very effective tool to facilitate the consumption and production of the correct products that consumers need. Thank you. Over.
Thank you. There is another question. The changes explained chicken and egg. Many actions by many stakeholders are needed for change. Do the speakers see one or two areas to be the most important to help to break into this, to make the first start for significant change? I think that's a question to all of you. Do you see that one or two areas where we can say, this is where we start from, our low-hanging fruit? Yeah, who is going to start?
Yeah, I can come.
Yes, please.
Yeah, I think Michael sort of alluded to parts of this question in terms of the fact that we're dealing with this, systemic issue here, but we tend to try and solve it piecemeal and not so much bring all our brains together and work as a system. So I know that Tobias just gave some examples of liberalization in Zimbabwe, but I've also got another example which goes back quite a bit, probably close to Zimbabwe's independence in the 1980s, where government actually wanted to promote small grains, and they offered because then government was in control of the market, but they offered very good prices that were on par with maize. And we saw farmers respond, especially the commercial farmers. So we filled our silos with small grains, but there was no taker for that grain. The market was not prepared to actually consume that grain, both from the industrial side as well as the household consumers. And so the perceptions and the narrative, I think, is an area that needs to be sorted out. The irony of it is that, yes, Tobias says he saw some food in the supermarket from the small grains, etc. I have an experience where I feel that those are niche markets. The people that are buying those grains are people that are aware of the nutritional benefits and not necessarily the bigger consumers that we want to target with this, so that we can create in high demand so that the farmers can respond to that actual demand. You also see the private sector responding to that demand because they can now provide seed because there's a market. So the whole value chain needs to sit down and say, okay, where are the bottlenecks? And we try and see which ones sequentially should we be pressing, which button should we press, so that we can actually get to a place where we have a value chain that is vibrant, a value chain that will stand on its own against the major value chains like maize, wheat, and rice. So that is what is missing, that knowledge and also the demand from consumers to say, yeah, we're demanding small grains because we know it's good for us. I will go to a supermarket, I'll go and buy those grains, but because I know the value of those grains. But most of the other consumers are not interested. As Michael said, they think that eating sorghum is associated with poverty. So the narrative and consumer education and also making sure that everybody's ready to move in as we change, and yeah, chicken and egg, but which button should you be pressing first? And that needs a multi-sectoral dialogue and again, to come up with a vision that says, this is who we are, this is where we're going, this player, this is what you're going to do. And we have the communication side taking care of the narrative at the same time. I know it's not easy, but we have to start somewhere. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have a last question, which is, what is the role of private industries in the transition towards sustainable food systems? So I would like to ask this question to Michael. But Michael, as you're answering this question, if you also give us a 1 minute final recommendation. So you answer this question, but plus also your final recommendation. And then from there, I'll ask Tobias to give his also final recommendations. And then finally, Dr. Sibanda. So over to you, Michael.
Yeah, thank you. Institutional markets we haven't spoken about here, and I would like to mention those before we leave, because they are one of the low-hanging fruits. Comes with ethical implications. It's not straightforward to change procurement in the humanitarian sector, for instance, but it's an opportunity and an immediate possibility. The role of the private sector and the industry undoubtedly is critical, because they broker commodity and food flows from producers to consumers. But the big question is, and we've only spoken about public policies, is how these private policies look like. Well, I would like to see way more commitment by the private sector to broker healthy food and nutrition, food that is produced sustainably and also passed on in a fair way. It doesn't have to be fair trade all the time, but trade based on principles of fairness, I would consider critical. So the food industries play a critical role. And to your question on what next, the final statement, as we have spoken about here on this panel, I believe that transition that we envision can only work with people. It's not a sole government responsibility, but the governments would have to provide the framework for citizens to come together and design their food needs and the type of food they want to eat in future. And that goes And that is done together with producers and the middle persons, the linkages. It's not desirable to do that without people. It won't be sustainable. This has to be a co-design arrangement, and policies that enable that are critical for doing so. Back to you.
Thank you. Dr. Takavarasha, your final comments?
Thanks a lot. This very interesting session. I have 2 take-home points which I want to highlight. One is linked to the question of the private sector, to concur with other speakers that the private sector really should be the key drivers for the transformation of sustainable food systems. They are the ones who have the capacity to buy, process, and market products. And the government's role should be to set the standard and the regulations that create a conducive environment, for the private sector to stimulate production, buy products, process them, and market them with a conducive environment and the ability to plan. The second point I need to emphasize again is that policy is a dynamic process. It needs a lot of evidence and the capacity for policy makers as well as policy advisors at all levels. And I see a major role for policy units and the think tanks at national and regional level that can allow free, independent sharing of information of what works best, what are the best practices, what are the lessons learned from different players, and be able to offer advice, because there's a lot that can be gained from sharing the experience. Even in these last 2 hours, we have learned a lot of what has been shared, of what is possible to do in Africa to impact policies through policy analysis and the evidence-based sharing of information. And the governments sticking to their role of giving policy direction, regulation, and standards, while facilitating farmers, producers, and the private sector to do the job. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Sibanda?
Thank you, Madam. I think the first thing I would want is restating what Michael said. It's about the governance of the food system, which is really the core design by all actors. And I think it resonates with my answer to the other question as to how we should tackle the chicken and egg affair. So the core design is critical. But I think government still has a role to play here. From that core design and having a common vision and sitting down as the food systems players, I would recommend that government invest in a smart way, smart investment by the government, because there's certain risks that private sector cannot take on. And, we're talking about the narrative and things like that. Who is going to do that? Because we're talking of a generic marketing type of thing, and no private sector is going to do that. So we'd want to see government take on this kind of common good type of projects and do this kind of thing and invest in that, reduce the level of risk so that private sector can now come in and do what they know how to do. Thank you, Madam.
Thank you very much, our panelists. At this point, I would like to, thank each one of you for really enlightening us in these 2 sessions. I think it's very clear that we have work to do as far as in this smart food, a good example being the small grains. We have a lot to do. And a lot of emphasis has been given on government place as far as the policy is concerned. This is creating the enabling environment, but also you are mentioning that there is need for them to also put investment. Another area is where this is going to be the work of all of us, different stakeholders, public sector, as well as private sector. There is also need to get focused. We need to get some low-hanging fruits. For example, you have highlighted market institutions. We can move very quickly, but also some education around the smart foods that we are talking about, so that people's perceptions should definitely change. So at this juncture, I want to thank you for your participation.